The world was packed earth and silence. For May, the silence was the heaviest part, a dense, suffocating blanket that pressed down harder than the tons of dirt above their heads. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of sound, the memory of her father's cough, the echo of laughter from a life before this burrow. Now, there was only the shallow rasp of her mother's breathing and the soft, rhythmic scrape of her own fingernail against a splintered support beam. Dust, fine as milled flour, coated everything. Her tongue, the inside of her eyelids, the worn fabric of her trousers. It was the taste of being buried alive. Fear had long ago curdled into a permanent, low ache in her belly, a cold stone of certainty that this dirt would one day be their tomb. They had been beneath the scorched California soil for a year, a secret sown into the earth after the last of the railroad money dried up and the signs in the towns started screaming for them to leave. Her father had dug this warren with the last of his strength, a desperate act of preservation, before the dust had claimed his lungs for good. He was buried not 10 feet from where she now sat, a part of the earth that both hid and imprisoned them. Then came the sound. It was not the familiar skittering of a lizard or the muffled sigh of the wind across the scrubland above. This was different. A rhythmic, violent thump. Pause. Thump. It was heavy, deliberate, human. May's hand froze mid-scrape. Her eyes, accustomed to the gloom lit only by a single, sputtering tallow lamp, darted to her mother. Her mother's eyes were wide, twin pools of terror in her gaunt face. Her little brother, asleep in a hollowed-out nook, whimpered and stirred. The thumping grew louder, closer, directly overhead. It was the sound of a shovel striking the hard, sun-baked crust of their ceiling. Each blow was a hammer against May's heart. They have found us. The thought was not a panic, but a cold, flat finality. This was the end they had always known was waiting. The digging stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, stretched thin and taut with dread. A scraping sound, then a crack spiderwebbed across the packed earth above the lamp. A sliver of blinding, painful daylight pierced their world. Dust and pebbles rained down, extinguishing the flame and plunging them into absolute darkness, save for that single, accusatory beam of light. A shape blocked it, the silhouette of a man, broad-shouldered and solid, looking down into their grave. May scrambled in front of her mother and brother, a small, fierce shadow against the sudden, brutal intrusion of the outside world. He did not speak. The foreigner stood silhouetted against a sky so pale and vast it seemed to mock their cramped existence. May could see the rough weave of his trousers, the worn leather of his boots planted on the edge of the hole he had made. He held the shovel like a weapon, its spade glinting in the harsh light. She held her breath, expecting the shout, the call for others, the cascade of violence that had haunted her nightmares. Instead, there was only his stillness, his silent appraisal. From her low vantage point, he was a giant, an arbiter of their fate. She could feel her mother's trembling behind her, the small hands clutching the back of her shirt. May pushed herself taller, making her body a shield. Her gaze was locked on the shadowy form, a challenge in her eyes that she did not feel in her heart. Let him see we are not animals, she thought, a surge of defiant pride cutting through the fear. Let him see we are people. He was there for an eternity that was likely only a minute. He shifted his weight, and the movement sent a fresh shower of dirt into her eyes. Then, without a word, he pulled back from the hole, plunging them once more into near-total darkness. His footsteps receded. They waited. Every nerve ending was a wire humming with tension. They listened for the sound of horses, for the shouts of a posse from the nearest town. Nothing came but the whistle of the wind, a lonely sound that now seemed like a reprieve. Hours passed. The single shaft of light from the hole in their roof crept across the dirt floor, a slow, silent sundial marking their suspended doom. Hunger, forgotten in the initial terror, returned as a sharp, cramping pain. Just as dusk began to bleed the light from the sky, the footsteps returned. May tensed, her hand closing around a jagged piece of rock. The silhouette reappeared, blocking the fading rectangle of violet sky. Something was lowered through the hole on a length of rope. A wooden bucket. The smell hit her first, clean, cool, impossible. Water. It landed with a soft thud. Then another object followed, a rough burlap sack that slumped beside it. The man's shape vanished again. There was no explanation, no demand. Just the offering. For a long time, no one moved. Could be a trap. The water could be fouled. But her brother's parched whimper broke the spell. May crawled forward, her movements cautious. She dipped her fingers into the bucket. The water was real. The sack was heavy with flour and a handful of withered apples. This act of mercy was more unsettling than a threat would have been. A threat was simple. This was complex, a question she could not answer. He was working the land, this plot granted to him by a government that saw the ground as empty, a blank space on a map. He owned the earth that held them. Yet he had not destroyed them. He had fed them. The days fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. May would watch him through the hole, a secret observer of her own captor-provider. He worked from sunup to sundown, a solitary figure wrestling with the stubborn, unforgiving soil. He was as silent as they were, a man who seemed to speak the land's own language of grit and endurance. He never tried to look in, never called down to them. But every few days a bucket would be lowered. Water, flour, sometimes a rabbit, skinned and cleaned. He was keeping them alive. And May, watching the ripple of muscle in his back as he swung a pickaxe, began to see not a monster, but a man as trapped by the landscape as they were. The cold came first as a whisper on the wind, a sharper edge to the night air that seeped through the cracks in their earthen roof. Soon it was a constant, biting presence that leached the warmth from their bones. The foreigner, Elias, as she had heard a passing wagon driver call him, began spending his days fortifying his small sod cabin, chinking the walls with mud and straw against the coming winter. He worked with a grim urgency that mirrored the anxiety growing in May's own chest. Their meager supplies would not last. The ground was too hard for him to dig for the wild roots he sometimes left them. The rabbits had vanished. Survival, which had been a quiet, constant struggle, was becoming a desperate, shrieking need. The danger, she realized, was not just the cold, but the scarcity that made men cruel. That cruelty arrived on a steel-gray afternoon, in the form of two riders. May saw them from her vantage point, two hard-looking men with rifles laid across their saddles, their faces pinched and mean from wind and suspicion. They dismounted near Elias's cabin, their voices carrying on the thin air, sharp and demanding. May pressed her ear to the wall of their burrow, her heart hammering against her ribs. They were asking about gold, about his claim. They accused him of being secretive, of hiding something. A man alone don't buy flour for three. One of them rasped, his voice a venomous thing. What are you feedin' down in the dirt, Thorn? A gopher. Elias's voice was low, steady. He denied it. He told them to leave his claim. The men laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. May knew, with chilling certainty, that they would not leave. She could hear their heavy boots crunching on the gravel, moving away from the cabin, moving closer to the slight, almost unnoticeable depression in the earth that marked the main part of their hidden home. He was standing in their way. Get aside. The lead man, Jedediah, snarled. We aim to see what you're so keen on protectin'. There was the sound of a scuffle, a grunt of pain from Elias. A terrible choice unfurled in May's mind. To stay hidden was to let him be beaten, perhaps killed, and for them to be unearthed like vermin. To emerge was to face the guns, to reveal their secret to the world. Her mother grabbed her arm, her eyes pleading. No. But May looked at her little brother, his face pale with fear, and saw not an end, but a reason. She could not let their story finish here, in the dark, without a fight. Grabbing her father's old, sharpened hoe, the one tool he had kept from their life before, she scrambled up the narrow entrance tunnel. She burst into the blinding, cold daylight, a creature of earth and shadow. She held the hoe before her, its blade a crescent of dull, menacing steel. The two men froze, their mouths falling open at the impossible sight of her. For a moment, all that could be heard was the wind. The sight of her, small and fierce with her makeshift weapon clutched in her hands, shattered the confrontation. Jedediah stared, his cruel certainty momentarily replaced by stunned disbelief. Elias used that single precious second. He lunged, not at Jedediah, but at the second man, driving his shoulder into the man's gut and sending him staggering backward. The clearing erupted into a desperate, graceless brawl. It was not the clean violence of stories. It was clumsy, brutal, and terrifying. May stood her ground, the hoe held between her and Jedediah. He recovered from his shock, a vile sneer twisting his lips. "Well, I'll be," he spat, his eyes roaming over her with a possessiveness that made her skin crawl. "Hidin' a little china doll." He took a step toward her, dismissing her as a threat. It was his mistake. She did not retreat. With a cry that was torn from the very depths of her soul, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage, she swung the hoe. She did not aim to kill, but to warn, to create space. The sharpened edge sliced through the fabric of his sleeve, drawing a red line along his forearm. He bellowed in pain and surprise, jumping back. The fight between Elias and the other man was a tangle of limbs and curses. They rolled on the hard ground, Elias grunting with effort, his face grim and set. He was strong, but his opponent was wiry and fought dirty, clawing and biting. Seeing his partner wounded, the second man scrambled for his dropped rifle. Time slowed. May saw the glint of the barrel, the man's desperate reach. Before he could grasp it, a small stone flew through the air and struck his hand. Her little brother, stood at the entrance of the burrow, his face streaked with tears and dirt, another rock already in his small fist. The distraction was enough. Elias surged, landing a solid punch that sent the man sprawling, dazed. Jedediah, clutching his bleeding arm, looked from Elias, to May, to the small boy at the mouth of the tunnel. His confidence was broken. He was outnumbered not by strength, but by a ferocity he hadn't expected. He spat on the ground. "This ain't over, Thorn," he snarled, but there was no conviction in it. He hauled his dazed companion to his feet, and they stumbled back to their horses, casting hateful glances over their shoulders before riding off into the gray expanse. The silence they left behind was profound, broken only by the ragged sound of breathing. Elias leaned against the wall of his cabin, a dark bruise already purpling his cheekbone. May stood frozen, the hoe still gripped in her hands, its weight a strange comfort. The cold air stung her face. It was the first time she had stood under an open sky without fear of being seen. The secret was broken. The earth between them had been breached, not by his shovel, but by shared violence. He pushed himself off the wall and walked slowly toward her. She flinched, expecting, she didn't know what. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze falling to the bloody gash on her hand, where she had gripped the rough handle of the hoe too tightly. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her, then at the burrow where her mother and brother were now tentatively emerging, and then back to her. In his eyes, she saw not pity or anger, but a deep, weary understanding. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement, a truce, a pact sealed in the dust and blood of the land they now shared. That night, for the first time, a fire burned in his cabin, and its light was a beacon. He brought them a blanket and gestured for them to come inside, away from the burrow's damp chill. They huddled on one side of the small room, he on the other. Words were unnecessary. They had faced the same threat, bled on the same soil. The land was no longer just his by a foreigner's law. It was theirs by the fierce, undeniable right of survival. She had thought the ground was their prison, a place to hide from the world. But she was wrong. It was their foundation. From this harsh, ungiving earth, something new was growing. In the days that followed, May began to work above ground, her movements no longer furtive. She helped him clear stones from a small patch of land, her hoe now a tool of cultivation, not defense. He taught her, with gestures and single words, how to set a snare. Her brother, no longer confined to the shadows, chased lizards in the sunlight, his laughter a sound May thought she would never hear again. Their underground home remained, a root cellar for their supplies and a shelter from the worst of the winds. But it was no longer their world. The world was the vast, aching sky, the endless horizon, and the quiet companionship of two solitary people bound together by a patch of dirt and the will to endure.